Okay. Good evening. Welcome to our program, Enslaved at the Georgetown Hotel. I am Dawn Chitty, the Director of Education at the African American Civil War Museum. I am joined by my colleague, Edwin Gassaway, the Operations Manager. And somewhere on here I know is our Director, Dr. Frank Smith, and Board Chair, Audrey Hinton. To our listeners, thank you for joining us. And this is a reminder to check our website, which is listed in the chat box, afroamcivilwar.org. It is through the generous support of our patrons that we are able to have programs like this. Our guest tonight is Miss Yvette LaGonterie. She is retired from a lengthy federal career where she held senior positions in immigration, international affairs, and homeland security. She has been an avid family historian for over 20 years. She holds a BA in mass communications with a minor in history and a master's degree in public administration. Ms. LaGonterie currently serves on the board of Reading Partners DC, is a voluntary literacy tutor, and is the chair of the advisory board of MIRR Alliance. Now, Ms. LaGonterie will give us the background history of the Georgetown Hotel story. In the last 20 minutes, I will pull questions from the chat box, so be sure to include your questions in the chat box there while she is presenting, and I'll pull from them in the last 20 minutes. And as always, please, so that she doesn't have any distractions while she's presenting, if you could place your sound on mute, that would be great. So without further ado, let's get started.
Thank you so much, Dawn. It's my pleasure to be here with the African American Civil War Museum. I've enjoyed visiting it, and I've enjoyed visiting the monument there. And for those who haven't, I hope you have a chance to. My presentation tonight is called Enslaved at the Georgetown Hotel. And for a little bit of background about it, it started with a family story from a man that I've known all my life as Uncle Bobby, who is related to me through his marriage to a first cousin of my mother's. And he told me that his family went back for generations in Georgetown, and his daughters started to investigate to find out more about that family history. And I picked it up and discovered what I'm going to show you tonight. And the story of 3 generations of Uncle Bobby's family helps illustrate what life was like for African Americans in Georgetown at that time. So it's a 100-year story. And I look forward to your questions at the end. At this time, I'm going to share the screen with my presentation to get started. So again, this is a 100-year story. It's actually 3 families that will be talked about: the Clarkes, the Dyers, and the family of their enslaver, Eleanor Lang. We'll talk about the environment and the petition process. The Clarkes and Dyers were emancipated in 1862 based on a law that was passed, and we'll talk some about it, and then about their life after emancipation. So their enslaver, Eleanor Ridgely Lang, she was the widow of an oyster seller named John Lang. After she was widowed, she became quite active herself in business, keeping up his business as an oyster seller and a caterer in Georgetown. Then in 1834, she took over the Georgetown Hotel. In 1824, while she was still working the oyster business, she purchased a girl. The girl's name was Mary. And this is the bill of sale that you see. Eleanor Lang purchased Mary from James and Debbie Essex. And she paid them about, I think it was about $900. And Mary was intended to be a slave for life. James and Deborah Essex were neighbors of hers. And later, actually, one of Eleanor's daughters married James Essex. The year before Eleanor purchased Mary, Deborah Essex, the mother of James, gave Mary and 4 other slaves to Deborah as a gift based on her affection. She gifted these 4 individuals to her son, who then later sold them to Eleanor. Then in 1825, Eleanor bought a second 14-year-old girl, and that was Mary Ann. And here we see the bill of sale for Mary Ann, which indicates Mary Ann is a slave for life. And she was sold on February 13th, 1825. She was purchased from William Marbury, who was a very prominent individual in Georgetown and Maryland. He was an attorney, and he's very well known to anyone who's been to law school for the case of Marbury versus Madison, an early case before the Supreme Court that established very important things in the new republic, the new United States, including the principle of judicial review. So he's quite famous in many ways and was very wealthy. But one of the things that's notable in this bill of sale is that this little girl, Mary Ann, was purchased in February, but not delivered to Eleanor until November of 1825. So this may indicate that Mary Ann, who we learned later was born in Maryland, may have been at his family's plantation, or it could have been at someone else's plantation, because William Marbury, as an attorney, often was the executor of estates of other people. So from the time that Eleanor paid William Marbury for this girl, it took that long for her to be taken from her family in Maryland and brought to live with Eleanor in 1825, later in 1825. But at that time when Mary Ann came, she would have found Mary, a girl about her age, and both of them having been torn from their families, became like sisters. And we will see that to be a fact as we see what happens in their lives. Now, the environment for these girls in Georgetown was dangerous. To be an enslaved person, or any person of color was dangerous because they all lived under the black codes. So even free blacks certainly did not have the freedom of white people of any class, and were subject to all types of punishments. And here, just as an example of something that seems so unnecessary and so just horrible to show how difficult their lives could be, it was a punishment for a slave for sitting, standing, or lying upon a bench in the stalls of the market house. So it was in law. This is just one of the many, many things in a very thick volume that made up the black codes, the ordinances in Georgetown. So a person who was enslaved could be whipped if they were found to do this, because it was the owner of the slave who would be given a fine. And if that owner did not pay the fine, the enslaved person would be subject to a whipping. And as you see, that would be 10 stripes in this case. But also in Georgetown, as well as all of Washington, D.C., it was a major slave market at the time that these girls came to live in the city. And that continued to be a major slave market until 1850, when there was a compromise of 1850 that prohibited the continue of slave markets in DC. But DC was one of the major slave markets in the country. And there was also a place, since it was the seat of government, that the abolition movement became very active. And what you see here is part of a broadside that was passed out that was against slavery, and very much complaining that DC continued to be a slave market when it was the capital and supposedly the land of the free. But just like now, even international pressure came into effect as well, as well as this domestic argument was going on about slavery. But there was a great deal of international criticism because there was the seat of diplomacy as well. And there were diplomats in Washington, DC, and they reported that America was a very brutal country, a very primitive country, because what was seen in the streets were slave markets auctioning off people, human beings, and also couples of shackled slaves frequently marching through the streets. And it was considered to be kind of backward because most of Europe by that time had barred slavery. In fact, all of Western Europe had. 1838, and the British had banned slavery in their colonies, emancipated everyone who was enslaved. And by 1848, the French had done the same. So in 1835, the girls that were living with Eleanor, and by then Mary Ann had one child, a daughter, Elizabeth, they were told that they were going to move to a tavern that Eleanor Lang first took over to manage, and then later on she came to possess it. But the tavern at that time was known as McCandless Tavern. That was the owner just before Eleanor Lang purchased. He died while he was managing and owning the tavern. But the tavern was very well known as a slave market. So just in my imagination, this would have been known to all Black people in the community that slaves were frequently sold, that slave traders frequently stayed. Advertisements were placed all the time in the newspaper saying that there was a slave trader was there, you could be found there, I want to buy enslaved people, contact me there. And so this is an example of a type of ad that was placed, and this was placed frequently, ads at McCandless Tavern or other taverns in Georgetown. So now this is a description of Eleanor Lang after she purchased the Georgetown Hotel. It was before McCandless Tavern. She renamed it Georgetown Hotel, and she's advertising here that she has upgraded the facility. Now, after McCandless died, those who were managing the hotel at first, the estate before Eleanor came in, they also placed ads in the newspaper saying that they were no longer involved in the slave trade, naming, that there were still ads in the newspapers from slave traders naming that tavern, but the tavern was no longer involved in the slave trade. So we can hope for the sake of the girls and the families that they were beginning to raise in that location that was not the type of clientele there, but nevertheless, their environment was still filled with the dangers of the slave trade. Even for free Blacks were frequently kidnapped. And a review of the newspapers, you see the frequency that happened. And and even free Blacks could be sold into slavery because they did not pay fines, including even the fine for being unlawfully incarcerated. For a free person to be arrested till they could prove they were free, they would then have to pay the cost of their detention while they were proving that they were free. And if they did not pay their debts, it was possible for them to be sold into slavery as well. Now the two girls began to have families. So if you see on the slide, this says Eleanor's families equal Eleanor's increase, because these were her dividends. Two young girls began to have children. So in 1830, we know in the mid-1820s, Eleanor purchased two teenage girls. And by 1830, there was one female under 10, and that was Mary Ann's daughter, Elizabeth. By 1840, there were 7. In 1850, there were still 7. And in 1860, there were 9. And I examine these numbers because they tell something about the families and what was happening with them. And what I do notice is that in 1860, there were 3 adult females and 6 children. There were no adult or late teenage males in the household. But later we're going to see that there were adult male children for Mary and Mary Ann, but we don't see them in the household. And that tells me something else about what Eleanor Lang was doing with the people who were enslaved to her. But in any case, for the investment of 2 14-year-old girls, Eleanor Lang, she increased her wealth by having, at this point, we see 1869 enslaved people, but probably more, because just like now, the census was only telling how many, the people who lived in a household. So if there were people that were enslaved to Eleanor Lang living elsewhere, they would have been counted in someone else's household. We also see, we don't see the names of the people who were enslaved, because before emancipation, the census records, the federal census did not name enslaved people, only their age and a little bit of their description and their gender under the name of the person enslaving them. So fortunately, in 1862, slavery came to an end for the families, the Dyer and the Clarke families, who were at this point like one family. On April 16th, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation Act. Now, this was about 8 months before the Emancipation Proclamation. So the DC Compensated Emancipation Act is the only act in the United States that compensated enslavers for the loss of their unpaid labor. So this compensation is not to compensate those who were emancipated. This is compensating those who were enslaving the people who were emancipated. Now, there were some conditions to meet this. They had to file a petition, and those petitions also they have a wealth of information for family historians about the enslaved people who may be their ancestors, or for anyone who wants to research and to understand the lives and the conditions of enslaved people in DC at that time. Now, DC always had a sizable African-American population, but at that time, the majority of the African-American population in DC was free. So at this point, they were about 20% of the population was enslaved, and that was about 3,100 individuals. The rest of the African-Americans in the city were free people, but the 3,100 enslaved people mixed with them all the time. So what we see here, the enslaver, to get compensation, had to demonstrate that they were loyal to the Union. So someone who was loyal to the Confederacy and could not sign the oath credibly would not be able to get compensation for the emancipation. And it's also important to note, the enslaver did not have to take any action in order for the enslaved people to be liberated. Because on April 16th, when President Lincoln put his pen to that paper, every individual enslaved in DC was immediately emancipated without any other action that needed to be taken. But the actual law was passed by Congress 7 days prior, 7 to 10 days prior to that. And there was an outcry from the enslavers who felt like this was too soon. What was going to happen to them? Suddenly they would lose all their labor. So Lincoln delayed his signatures on that to give a little time for these enslavers to get used to this. So these folks that had been enslaved all of their lives, they still had to wait a little bit longer for the comfort of the enslavers. So there was a little minus to the justice there. But now, as I mentioned, some of the enslavers were not able to petition for themselves, because they were not loyal to the Union or for any other reason. So in June of 1862, Congress considered that, and they passed a supplemental act that allowed the remaining emancipated to file their petitions on their own behalf so they could document their emancipation. They were already free, but they needed to document their freedom. Plus, they were able to even ask for their own, to be compensated themselves. So there were a handful of freed people that did receive compensation. And this is one of the few rare times in the United States that any person received compensation for having been enslaved. And of course, they did not receive it from the enslaver, they received it from the government. So here's the petition process again, where there's a lot of information again about the individuals. This is page 1 that we see on the screen. Here, Eleanor Lang, she named everyone who was enslaved to her, and with a little description about them, including their height and their coloring, and of course their age. And that's page 1, but on the next page, we get a little bit more. Here, Eleanor describes how she acquired these people, how they came to be enslaved by her. So here we see that Mary Dyer was purchased from James and Deborah Essex, as I showed you earlier in the bill of sale. But it was because of this petition that I was able to know where to look for the bill of sale, that this happened in 1824. So all of this documentation in DC was digitized for the 150th anniversary of the 1862 Act. So for DC, for researchers in DC, this is something that is easily available here that's not easily available in other parts of the United States for researchers. So then we see how all of the relationships are described, that Lizzie Clark and Henry Clark are the children of Mary Lingan, purchased from Colonel Marbury. And now we also see last names too. And we know that further south, it was very rare to see last names associated with enslaved people. But here in the District of Columbia, we see throughout the records that individuals were using last names, had adopted last names, and they were recognized by them. So here we go down here and we see some other things that enlighten us about how Eleanor Lang was able to leverage the enslavement of these people for her own wealth. One of the things here we see that Henry Clarke was insured, as was George Dyer. Now, these were, in 1862, 2 adult males, and they were not listed in 1860 on the census. Therefore, I suspect that Eleanor had hired them out. So they were not working in her household, in her hotel, but they were working elsewhere, and Eleanor was being paid for their labor. So now Henry and George may have been employed by someone else, probably, and it says they were house servants, but they were insured. So regardless of how they may have been treated by the employer who was paying Eleanor, Eleanor was secure that if they were to lose value, to be disabled, or even die at the hands of another employer, she had insurance, and so she would be paid anyway. Now, we also see the value that Eleanor attributes to them based on her appraisal of the individuals. So the enslavers now, trying to get the most that they could out of the compensation process, where they would want to say, of course, as you see here, Mary Dyer is healthy, an excellent cook. And Lizzie Clarke, we see, was a chambermaid in the hotel. But those appraisals are not what Eleanor received, because the law did limit payment to an average of $300 an individual. Of course, the slave market, the value of enslaved people had decreased, certainly after the Civil War, when no longer could people sell illegally at least, and sell their enslaved people to the southern states where the greatest market was at that time. And the other, going back even to the passage of the 1862 Act, and you know that is 1 year into the Civil War. And the reason that these acts of emancipation for the emancipation in DC had come up many times in Congress, but had never been passed. Why was it passed in 1862? Because the southern states were no longer part of the Union. Their representatives, their elected representatives, were now part of the Confederacy. So they were not part of the US Congress. So they were not there to object or to vote against this act, to the Emancipated Compensation Act. So that's how it was finally passed. Now, moving on to the next page, we see that there is a claim here too that's made that it must be noted. So your petitioner's claim is subject to a deed of trust dated July 19th, 1858. And it was recorded. And so I got a copy of that deed of trust. In this case, I saw that in 1858, Eleanor, she used her enslaved people as collateral on a loan. So she was able to take a loan. And if she did not pay her debt, the person she was indebted to, Peter Von Essen, another neighbor, another tavern owner as well, he would have been able to take claim and do what he would like to do with them, sell them anywhere and in any place without any other interruption in that. And so their lives were tentative and things were precarious for them. And if you read the classified ads in the newspapers of the time, you would see this was a frequent occurrence, that enslaved people were being sold for the debts of their owners. They were being sold because their owner did not pay rent or did not pay whatever bill that was due. Those individuals could be taken and sold away from their families and far away into the deep South, which is basically what people certainly did fear. And here's a copy of that from that deed of trust. So as you see, at such time and on such terms as he would like to make, from the District of Columbia as to removal, no limitation as to removal from the District of Columbia at public or private sale at the discretion of the trustee. So again, as we see, their lives were not in their control, and it was a frightening way to have a family. So as I mentioned, Eleanor Lang had to get her enslaved people appraised and put her claim in for compensation, but the government also hired an appraisal as well. So she submitted hers, as we see now, using through her attorney, who happened to also be the off-again mayor of Georgetown. Everyone listed here, and her appraisement and the value written out. But before that could be done, there were still a few more steps before she could receive compensation. The commission that had been set up by the government to administer this process had to actually see these individuals. So the enslaved, or formerly enslaved people, because they were free, they had to appear before the commission and give evidence of their existence, as well as they might say that she's making a false claim. I was actually free, you shouldn't pay her. But what was their incentive to? I imagine their incentive was because through completing the petition process, through making their appearance, they also could guarantee that the record of their emancipation, of their freedom was entered, was documented. And that was still very important because even though slavery had ended in DC, slavery and the Fugitive Slave Act was still in effect, even in DC. So fugitives could still be sought after and taken from DC. And that includes even if they came from the neighboring states of Maryland or Delaware, because those were still slave holding states. Although they were part of the Union, as you recall, they were allowed to continue to hold slaves, to enslave people, even after the Emancipation Proclamation. They were able to do that, in fact, until the 13th Amendment. So here, another step that Eleanor Lang had to take was published in the newspaper. So all of the petitioners were listed, excuse me, in the newspaper with what their claim was, who the enslaved people was, sort of like marriage bans that were published so that if anyone objected, they could make that known. In this case, this was published, and if anyone had reason to refute the claim that was being made by the enslaver, they were to report that to the commission. So the commission could examine whether or not there was something false or exaggerated in the claim made by the person seeking this compensation. So for several days, there was a supplement to the local newspapers listing everyone there. And we see our families here, all listed, the 10 individuals. Now here's the final record showing what the compensation was. We see Eleanor's claim, and then in the light print in the middle was the government assessor's claim. And then finally, the commission would arrive at their decision, which was often somewhere in between, sometimes more than what the government assessor said and sometimes less. But she received considerably less than what she claimed, about half of what she was asking for. So now it's after 1862. Our families, we'd seen that there were 3 generations from Mary and Mary Ann who were purchased to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth had several children who were Eleanor's increase, and they were emancipated with her. But now they continue to live in Georgetown, but as free people. So there they were in the 1860s in Georgetown in the middle of the Civil War. And the Civil War was very evident throughout DC, of course, and very evident in Georgetown. The map you see, the little red crosses you see, were Civil War hospitals that were set up throughout Georgetown as well as throughout the city. So our families, the Clarks and the Dyers, would have seen everything that was related to the war: the wounded, the refugees who were fleeing slavery and coming into DC. They would have seen the US colored troops, as well as all other types of troops and evidence of the war. And finally, they would have seen the celebrations of the end of the war in 1865. But this must have all given them reason for hope for the future. And we see that they move on in life. Now, the question that often people have are whether the enslaved people continued to work and reside with the person who enslaved them. And what the research shows, at least for DC, is that in most cases in DC that they did not. They moved on and got their employment elsewhere. And there was plenty of opportunity during the Civil War because the city of DC was growing. It doubled during that size. There were also many factories outside of DC for munitions that were being started. There was a great demand for laborers in these areas and laborers in all areas. But it appears here that our family stayed in DC. We see everyone, we see 9 of the members of the family continue living together. Here, we see in 1863 that George Dyer, 23 years old, the son of Mary Dyer. He registered for the draft and was living at 28 Dumbarton Street in Georgetown, employed as a feed salesman. Now on M Street in Georgetown, there was an African-American owned business, Alfred Lee's Feed Store, a very large business, that very established. And in some reports, it was believed, according to newspaper reports in DC, that it was the largest and the oldest business, African-American business in the country. That is not true, but it may have been true for DC. So also moving on, we see that Mary Jane Clarke, the eldest of Elizabeth, Lizzie Clarke's daughters, she married Charles Stewart and she started her family. Well, I was very excited when I found this record showing that Mary Dyer, who was then the matriarch of the family, because we don't see Mary Ann any longer. We did not see her in the claim, the emancipation claim. And we didn't see her. She didn't appear to be living in the 1850 or the 1860 census records because there was no one of her age listed there. So Mary Dyer, who she had lived with like a sister, became the matriarch of the Clarke and Dyer families. And now Mary and Elizabeth were listed in the census and in the directories of DC as working as laundress. That was their occupation. But remarkably, Mrs. Mary Dyer, who was then actually a widow, her husband, George Dyer, had died at some point in the 1860s. He had been listed earlier in the city directory as working at the Exchange House, but by 1867, she was listed as a widow. But somehow, remarkably and wonderfully, she acquired the $750 to purchase a home on Dumbarton Street. And I wonder if that's 750 or 750, but I think it's 750 in that first part, maybe a smeared $sign because there's a $sign below. But she purchased the house where they were living on Dumbarton Street. And at this auction, Thomas Dowling was a major auctioneer in DC. But it's with great pleasure that she was able to acquire this, I'm sure, for the family, bringing them now from enslaved people into free people and to homeowners, into the burgeoning middle class of the emancipated people. Of course, in DC, among African Americans, there already was an established middle class from the free Black Americans that were there. There were many African American churches and schools and business owners, as I mentioned, the Alfred Lee business, and there were doctors and other professionals. But now the Dyer and the Clarke families, newly emancipated, are able to begin lives as free people too. So in 1870, a year later, we see the Dyers and Clarkes listed at the home on Dumbarton Street. We see Mary Dyer is the owner. The value of the house there is listed as $1,800, and she has another $200 too. She's there with the rest of the family, her son George and Elizabeth Clarke, and Elizabeth's children who were still in the house. One of her daughters, as we know, had married, and the youngest child, Frank, who was emancipated with them, is not there. And given the infant mortality rate, he probably had passed away. We see that her son, Elizabeth Henry, his occupation is a barber. He's then 18 years old. And to be a barber at that time was a very good occupation, of skilled worker, and it could lead to having your own business. And certainly it was a good way to earn a very good wage. Now families that start to marry and establish their own families. And we see that, that in 1875, Alfred Clarke, he marries another woman from Georgetown, Virginia Cole, also known as Jennie. Jennie came from a free African-American family. She was born free, as were her parents, and she was a Catholic. So this record we see is from the Holy Trinity Church, the oldest Roman Catholic church in DC, which is in Georgetown, and they were married there. You see that Alfred Clarke's mother's name is listed. He is the child of Elizabeth Clarke, and that for Jennie Clarke, she's named, her father's name, Robert Cole. So again, we are not seeing the name of Alfred Clarke's father, which is of interest. Also, Alfred's sister, Eliza, she married Sidney Sims in 1874 when she was 24 years old. And Sidney was from Virginia. Sidney, at the time they married, was a coachman, but soon later he was hired by the federal government as a civil servant, listed in the volumes that would list all civil servants at the time with their appointments. And he was employed at the Department of the Interior as a copyist. And this implies that Mr. Sims had a very high level of literacy, because a copyist, as you know, we have photocopier machines now, and we can just put something down and push a button and we get a copy. But at that time, if you wanted to have copies of documents, you needed a copyist, someone who would write out copies of a written document. And he was employed in this way, along with many others, but he would have had a very high degree of literacy to have had that employment. Now, the photo that you see here is a photo passed down to the Clarke family. And it was passed down and believed to be a photo of Alfred Clarke, the son of Lizzie, who was emancipated from the Georgetown Hotel, and the grandson of Marianne. And at the time he was emancipated, he was 10 years old. And Eleanor Lang's petition said he was a house servant at the time and gave him the value of $500. Now, again, this was passed down as a photo of Alfred Clarke. And remember for persons who knew Alfred Clarke, but knew him as a much older man, for example, his grandchildren, to resemble him. Now we're going to look at another photo of Alfred Clarke. And some suspect that it may not be the same person, although there is some resemblance. So it's possible that this may be Alfred Clarke's unnamed father. We see that he has a very European appearance, as did Alfred Clarke, although in Alfred Clarke in the next photo, you'll see some differences. Now there's Alfred Clarke in a locket with a photo of his wife, Jennie Clarke. And you can see him as a young man, dressed very distinguishedly, resembling the other photo, but perhaps there are some differences. And the other photo that we're seeing here with them is Volta Place in Georgetown, where Alfred and Jennie lived with their children for a very long time. They had a total of 11 children. In the 1880s, I think about 5 of those children were born. So at the other time, the other members of the family were still living on Dumbarton Street in the 1880s. But we'll see some other things that happened in the 1880s. Unfortunately, in the 1880s, that decade saw the death of several members of the family. In 1881, George Dyer, the only biological son of Mary Dyer, he died. Now he had married Mary Phoenix, another woman who had been emancipated in 1862. So he died, and he was buried in the Mount Zion Cemetery in Georgetown, which is an African-American cemetery associated with the Mount Zion United Methodist Church, which was founded in 1816. And it is the oldest African-American church in the District of Columbia. And the Mount Zion Church was located just a block and a half from the Dyer and the Clarke's home on Dumbarton Street. Now the church and the cemetery were also Underground Railroad locations where fugitive slaves were hidden on their way north. So now George Dyer died in 1881, and in 1883, Alfred and Jennie welcomed their third son and named him George Dyer Clarke. Now Alfred's elder brother, the barber, William Henry Clarke, he died in 1885. Now remember, he was emancipated in 1862 at 13 years old. And as reported in the Evening Star, the DC newspaper, his funeral was held at the home of his aunt, Mary Dyer. And you can see the article there from the Evening Star. And then presumably there would have been a march from the home on Dumbarton Street to the church, Mount Zion ME Church, Methodist Episcopal Church, and afterwards to the cemetery for his burial. The cemetery is also in Georgetown. And Alfred and Jennie, they had a child in 1885, and they named him William Henry, after the brother who they lost. Now, the next very sad thing is the matriarch of the family and the person who purchased the home died in 1886, Mary Dyer. Now, the newspaper reported that Mary Dyer, colored woman, fell at the corner of 3rd and D Streets, and that her funeral was held at the Mount Zion Methodist Episcopal Church on July 13th. And she is also buried at the Mount Zion Cemetery. Now, she had a will, and she filed it, that was filed by the family in July of 1886. She left the majority of her property, as stated in the will, to her adopted daughter, Elizabeth Clarke. And she named Elizabeth's children and some of Elizabeth's grandchildren and her son's widow in the will. Now, I was moved by that, seeing adopted daughter Elizabeth Clarke, because again, I mentioned that Mary and Marianne at 14 years old came to live with an Eleanor Clarke as their slaves, and they must have been as sisters. And Mary Ann, she died before 1850, when Elizabeth was still quite young, and her brother Henry even younger. And so Mary must have become like a mother to Mary Ann's children. And as you see, they continued to live as a family. And there they were at the house. And in 1889, that adopted daughter, Elizabeth Clarke, she also passed away and was buried in the Mount Zion Cemetery as well. The 1890s came, and now there's no census record, unfortunately, no federal census for 1890 because of a fire that occurred many decades later in the archives. And so we don't have those records to see everything that was going on, but we still know a lot. We see Alfred's son here, Stuart Valentine Clarke, and he is my Uncle Bobby's father, actually, born on February 14th, 1893. So February 14th, we know why his middle name is Valentine. Now, we know other things going on in the 1890s, that the family continued to live in the house on Dumbarton Street. And a little bit I know about the house is from one article I found in the newspaper, and that's that Mary Jane Stewart, who was Mary Jane Clarke and had married Charles Stewart and was a widow at this time. She was a complainant and a witness against John William, who she accused of stealing 2 chickens from the yard of the family home at 2729 Dumbarton Street. And he was held on a $500 bond. Now, when Mary Dyer purchased the house, it was before Georgetown was fully incorporated into the District of Columbia. So the address had changed at that time. When she bought it, I think it was 28 Dumbarton Street. But after Georgetown was fully incorporated, the address has changed, and that address became 2729 Dumbarton Street. Now, Mary Jane Stewart, unfortunately, she died in 1898, and her funeral was at the Berrien Baptist Church. So we reached 1990, the turn of the century, and we see in the census who's living at the home on 2729 Dumbarton Street. And there is Eliza Sims, who was the widow now of Sidney Sims, who died and was buried in the Holy Rood Cemetery, which is a Roman Catholic cemetery that reserved a section for the colored, as they would call it at the time. And so Eliza had become a Roman Catholic as well. And there was her son, Justin, living with them. That 27 Dumbarton Street also happened to be just across the street from the Epiphany Roman Catholic Church. It still is right just across the street from Epiphany Roman Catholic Church, which was a church that was established by an African-American congregation that decided they no longer wanted to attend the Trinity Roman Catholic Church because Trinity insisted on segregating the African-American congregants there. And so the congregants decided they wanted their own church and not suffer that indignity. And the Epiphany Church was established just across the street from the home there on Dumbarton Street. Also living with Eliza are her sister's children, Charles, Ella, and Mattie from Martha. As again, we mentioned that Mary Jane had passed away. And 2 of Jenny and Alfred's children, remember they had 11 children. So 2 of them were living with their aunt Eliza Sims in the larger home on Dumbarton Street. There is the tombstone from the Holy Rood Cemetery for Sidney Sims. But the sad thing is that that Eliza's only son was also buried there with his father in 1911, that he died, and his funeral mass was held at the St. Augustine's Roman Catholic Church, which is moving closer to DuPont Circle, which is another African-American congregation established there, and a long-standing African-American congregation. And that church may be the church where the Sims family may have been associated with before. Perhaps they decided they preferred that for whatever reason. Now, in 1918, unfortunately, Alfred's wife, Jennie, died. And we see from the announcement in the newspaper, Jennie, beloved wife of Alfred Clarke and mother of naming many of the children. They were living at 1690 32nd Street Northwest at the time. But we also see that her funeral will be at the Holy Trinity Church. There'd be a requiem mass at 9 a.m. But there's another notice that follows that tells us that the ladies of the Olive Immediate Relief were notified of the death of Mrs. Jennie Clarke. So we expect then that Jennie Clarke was a member of the Ladies of Olive Immediate Relief. And Olive Immediate Relief was a mutual aid society where members, they paid dues, and the society would come to the aid of a member in need, whether if their economic need occurred because of illness or death. And so they would come to assist with the funeral and assist the family in a time of need. And those were the typical mutual aid societies established by African Americans throughout the country. Now, for the several years after Jennie's death, Alfred Clarke placed notices in the newspapers in memoriam of his beloved wife. So back to 2729 Dumbarton Street, which had become the family homestead. Well, the family sold it in 1925, although Mary Dyer's will had anticipated they would sell it sooner and split the money. But they waited till 2729, the remaining heirs at least, and sold the home. And that's just a copy of the deed. And the deed also spells out how Mary Dyer had passed the house to the heirs. But unfortunately, just a month after the sale of that house, where Alfred Clarke had inherited some of the proceeds, he passed away. And he's buried with his wife in the Holyrood Cemetery, Catholic Cemetery. But then in July 1926, Eliza Sims, who is then now the last of the 10 individuals, the 10 members of the family who were emancipated from slavery, she passes away as well. And so she was buried in the Holyrood Cemetery. And we also see from the advertisement here, the notice here, that she was a member of many different civic organizations. And which just shows that from that time, she acquired literacy and was very active in the community. But unfortunately, what we see in the in the notice is that she was hit by a car at 74 and that she was seriously hurt. And that was the cause of her death. Well, we're running short of time, so I'm going to move to the end of this presentation. These are just photos of the next generation of the family. Unfortunately, my Uncle Bobby, he passed away last year, so I do dedicate this to his memory. And I'll move this to the end and so that we can open this for questions. I'll turn this over to you, Dawn.
Hi. So that was a lot to take in and very informative. Wow. I have so many questions. I'm just like fighting in my head, like, where do I start? First, basically, where did you start with this research? Like, what was your biggest source of documents?
Well, fortunately, DC is a wealth of information, more than in most other jurisdictions. There is so much is documented, and it's so well organized in indexes. So if someone wanted to repeat this type of work, I would suggest they go to the library, the Washingtonian room in the Central Library. And there are great indexes, and they're very helpful and will help you find information related to this and where to go from there, how to get documents from the DC archives, for example, and some of the information is at the National Archives.
So how has knowing this history about your family impacted you and your family?
Well, again, they're related to me by marriage, but, always close to me. And I hope that many members of the family are all as interested as I am in the findings, and I'm finding that they are. And more of the Clarke descendants have come to my attention and been able to hear about the family history that I've uncovered for them.
Mm-hmm. So I do have a question that I found pretty interesting in the chat box from a Noreen Goodson. Where did you find the the compensation papers?
Well, the compensation papers, the full copies are available at the National Archives, but almost all of them are available right now online at Civil War DC. So the petitions have been digitized and transcribed. So if you want to do that type of research, it's available for free right online.
Hmm. So what lessons do you think that we could learn from the family's history?
I think it tells, everyone has a story. And I know we hear a lot about individuals who are particularly prominent based on some particular, accomplishment, or they're the first at that or the first at this. But I think this tells us the story of everyday lives and how African Americans coming out of enslavement, they established themselves quickly. They were industrious. And I think of Mary Dyer and how she took on as the matriarch of the family, earned money, was able to invest it in a home. She continued pushing ahead for her family, even that she was on the other side of town when she fell and was injured, which led to her death, tells me that she was involved in more than we yet know.
Mm-hmm. So the family lived in Georgetown in the 1800s. Just taking stock of like Georgetown then and today, like, basically what are some differences that you discern from just the community?
They were in Georgetown, and the differences between then and now.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think a lot of people don't realize that Georgetown was traditionally always about 30% African American, where now it is probably less than 10% African American. And those changes didn't occur to the mid part of the 20th century, when there were a lot of things that kind of pushed African Americans out, especially those who were renting homes. Those homes were often said to be uninhabitable. And then once African Americans were no longer living in them, the homes were refurbished and then sold at a much higher price. So, but I think at this day, when people come in there, they don't realize as they walk around and see these historic homes there, mm-hmm. that they were enslaved people who actually lived in those homes too, and are very much a part of the history of Georgetown, and that African Americans once thrived there, owning mm-hmm. businesses and running schools and et cetera.
Hmm. So why do you think that we don't hear more stories like this one in like mainstream popular history?
Well, even that we're celebrating, now we're coming to the close of African American History Month, that there had to be a time when a month where now we have to reserve a month to recognize and celebrate African American history, because traditionally history and US history has excluded that everything in history, giving people a distorted view of what the history of this country really was, because African Americans were involved in everything and everywhere in this country. There, to the most remote spot in this country, you will find an African American presence and part of the establishment of every part of the country, and as contributors to everything that has ever happened in this country.
Okay. So I have a question from Robert Farron. Yes, did their history motivate members of the Dyer and Clarke's family to participate in the 60s civil rights movement?
Well, I can't, the family at that point was quite dispersed, and people became involved in many different activities. And so I think to different extents among the descendants, our school teachers and people, other professions. There's an actress, there are novelists. So people became involved in very many things. And I think that their history is not so unique for African American people. So did their history, or did the history of any African American person inspire them to become part of the civil rights movement? Because most African Americans share a similar history. So I would say yes, that it is an inspiration, but it's also the circumstances that continued after the era that we see. We see here up until 1825, but conditions of oppression and discrimination continued. And I think all of that inspired African Americans from this family and others to be part of the civil rights movement.
Okay, awesome. So what's the next phase of your research? What are you currently working on?
Well, I continue to keep looking at the facts, and I learn what comes out is I learn more about things that were going on in the African American community. For example, their involvement in these different societies are all part of the story. A part of the story also is what they observed in their life in Georgetown, what were the other things that were going on that would have been influences in their life from their neighbors and from other happenings in the city. When the family were living at the Georgetown Hotel, they observed the civic government of Georgetown, because that is where the mayor held the meetings of the city, and even the Whig Party frequently, and other types of activity of historic nature were happening there. So they were there to observe those things.
Okay, so I have our board chair, Audrey Hinton, on the line, and she actually has a comment that she wanted to make. So if you wanted to make your comment, Audrey.
Sure, I'm here. Hello, Yvette. Thank you.
Hi.
Presentation and so
Thank
much
you.
research. I really appreciate all of the work you did, all of that research. I've done a lot of research on my family history, and my ancestors were enslaved in Kentucky and served in the United States Civil War and the United States Colored Troops. But what I learned is that there was compensated emancipation in Kentucky also, and probably, I guess, in the other border states, I'm not sure. But Abraham Lincoln, as an incentive to enslavers there, to let their enslaved people enlist in the war, compensated them, same amount of money, $300, but at the end of the war, where they didn't have to show up and be appraised and all that, but owners did get $300 for the service of their enslaved people in the war.
Thank you. I think I've heard that from you before, that was another one of the rare occurrences with the compensation in the US. Yes.
Yeah, thank you though.
So I have time for one more question, and it's from Dawn Young. Did you have a chance to research Olivet Immediate Relief? What church tied to, minutes found, members list?
No, I have not yet, and I hope to be able to find that too. And if you have a source, please send it to me.
So I want to say thank you. If there are no other questions, those are all the questions I had. It was an amazing presentation, and I think it really ties well into DC emancipation, which I think is very unique to the city, but also like the concept is not as unique as we think it is, because it was explored not just in DC, but also elsewhere in the world where slavery like this was occurring. I found it very fascinating when you talked about the two different appraisers and the differences in the appraisal backing, especially since the compensation only allowed them to get up to $300. So I imagine they wanted that appraisal to be as high as possible, so they could get that $300 for that enslaved person. I thought it was fascinating, and I imagine that if anyone has any other questions that we did not get to in the presentation, you're welcome to send them on to us, and we'll forward your information on to Ms. LaGonterie. And again, thank you for joining us this evening. For any other programs that we'll have, there's no more programs on the schedule for the month of February, but there are some in March. that will go up pretty soon. And for information about that schedule, again, our website is afroamcivilwar.org. And I think I placed it somewhere in the chat on here. So again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much.
Have a good evening.